A single mother helps a millionaire fix his broken car on the side of the road. And when he sees the ring on her finger, he is immediately stunned. No one had ever seen her before. No one remembered her name. But on that scorching afternoon, when the sun seemed to melt the asphalt, she became the lifeline for a man who appeared to have it all. In the harsh summer heat of Texas, the asphalt stretched out in a fiery blaze beneath the sun as though it were being burned away. The wind was nearly still. And there wasn't a tree in sight along the desolate road. The silver Maserati Quattroporte, a symbol of luxury, suddenly stalled in the middle of Highway 271, and white smoke began to rise from the hood. A clear sign of engine failure. Inside the car, Brandon Whitaker, CEO of the multinational conglomerate Whitaker Global, slammed his hand down on the steering wheel with the force of someone used to controlling everything, except moments like this. His face turned red with anger, but deeper than that, panic seeped into every fiber of his being. He glanced at his platinum Swiss watch worth $80,000. 11:43 a.m. Only 17 minutes left until the start of the billion-dollar strategy meeting with investors. A meeting that could decide the fate of the conglomerate he inherited from his unyielding father. He tore off his tie, undid the top button of his shirt, and stepped out of the car. The heat immediately slapped him in the face like a fist. Sweat poured down his back, soaking through his fine Italian silk shirt. He opened the hood, and a thick puff of smoke burst out, causing him to instinctively take a step back. For a moment, the man who had once controlled millions of dollars stood frozen, helpless, like a child lost for the first time. At that moment, an old engine rumbled in the distance. A battered, rusted Ford F-150 pickup truck slowly came to a stop by the roadside. The engine sputtered to a halt. The door opened. Out stepped a black woman with a firm stride and a look of no fear in her eyes. Her hair was tied back in a neat bun, her checkered shirt rolled up at the sleeves, her jeans stained with motor oil. Nothing like the polished image of a tech mogul lost in his high-tech failures. She planted her feet firmly on the ground, the sunlight reflecting off her brown skin, making her glow against the fiery backdrop of the sky. Her work gloves still on, a wrench resting on the passenger seat. She approached Brandon, sizing him up as if inspecting an old machine, then asked flatly, "Car's broken?" Brandon furrowed his brows, instinctively taking a half-step back. He wasn't used to being questioned first, especially not in a situation where he felt vulnerable. This woman was Rachel Monroe, a well-known mechanic in the area and a single mother on her way to the shop after picking up parts for a customer's truck. But Brandon didn't know that. To him, she was just a stranger appearing at the wrong time. Or rather at the perfect time to challenge his proud ego. What Brandon didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary woman in front of him, with her cold steel-like gaze, would be the one to unmask the Whitaker family's decades-long facade, starting with the sapphire ring on her finger. Brandon narrowed his eyes, a look of skepticism and irritation creeping into his gaze, as he noticed that the woman in front of him wasn't the least bit intimidated by his powerful appearance and designer clothes. He was used to polite nods, respectful yes sirs, and flattering smiles from employees, partners, and even the media. But this woman, Rachel Monroe, stood tall, eyes unflinching, voice firm, with no hint of submission. Brandon furrowed his brow, his lower lip slightly curling in the instinctive arrogance of someone born into privilege. "You're sure you know how to fix cars?" The question was not only filled with doubt, but also carried a quiet prejudice. A woman, a black woman, dressed like she worked with her hands. What could she possibly know about touching his million-dollar car? Rachel didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't show any emotion. She simply responded flatly. "I'm a mechanic. I have a shop 10 miles away." Her voice was mechanical, but her gaze was sharp. Without asking for permission, she moved forward, opened the hood again, leaned in to inspect, and in less than 30 seconds gave her conclusion. "Cooling systems busted. You've got about 5 minutes before you restart it, and the engine's gone. You're lucky." Brandon stood still, unable to say a word. Part of him was shocked by being stopped dead in his tracks. Another part of him was trying to analyze the situation. A businessman's habit, but what confused him the most wasn't the engine, but how she didn't see him as anything special. She didn't ask for the price, didn't butter him up. Rachel simply did her job. She walked back to her truck, retrieved an old oil-stained toolbox, and returned to the Maserati. Her hands, rough and blackened with grease, moved with the precision of a skilled artisan. She unscrewed, checked, reattached a hose, temporarily cooling the system by routing the coolant. Brandon couldn't help but stare, not because he was attracted, but Because of the sense of losing control. From the time he was a child, he had been taught that the world operated on hierarchy, the strong command, the weak obey. His father, Carter Whitaker, was the embodiment of that philosophy, a man who built the family's conglomerate into an empire with ruthless decisions and deals that the law hadn't caught up with. Brandon had been raised in that principle. He went to Yale, was sent to Harvard Business School not out of passion, but because Carter wanted an heir who wouldn't make mistakes. Every step of Brandon's life was a move on his father's chessboard. From his field of study to his best friend to his fiancée, Elise Harrington, the daughter of a fashion mogul, who Carter saw as the final move to corner the luxury consumer market. In that world, someone like Rachel, without family ties, no Ivy League degree, no connections to the powerful, was beneath his notice. Yet here she was saving his reputation just before a $1 million meeting. Rachel tightened the clamp, wiped her hands on a rag, and then quietly said, "It's done, but it's temporary. You've got about 2 hours before the car heats up again." Brandon swallowed hard, unsure whether to thank her or hide his discomfort. He wasn't used to feeling dependent, but he also wasn't used to the gaze of someone else that he couldn't read. She didn't seem to be trying to impress him, and that made him even more uneasy. He pulled out his wallet, took out a few hundred bills, and handed them over. But as she reached out to accept them, Brandon's gaze immediately froze. The bright sunlight reflected off something small on her finger. An old silver ring with a blue sapphire stone. The same piece of jewelry that had once belonged to his mother. The one that 10-year-old Brandon had secretly slipped into his pocket and quietly handed to a girl in an orphanage as a meaningless promise. "I'll come back." That ring, there was no mistaking it. And Rachel, this cold, indifferent mechanic in front of him, was no stranger. The moment Rachel reached out to take the money, Brandon's gaze suddenly froze. The $100 bills in his hand seemed to vanish from his awareness as the refracted light from a small object on her finger awakened a storm of forgotten memories that had slumbered for 20 years. The ring, a thin silver band with a classic design set with a deep blue sapphire unmistakable. Brandon's eyes widened, his heartbeat misaligning with his breath. That was the ring his mother had left behind before she passed away from cancer when he was just 9 years old. The very same ring that he had given to a little girl in the orphanage under the old oak tree as a promise that he would come back, that he wouldn't forget her. A small gift, but sacred in the heart of a lonely child amidst the cold world of the elite. And now it was on the hand of the woman he had both doubted and despised, Rachel Monroe. Brandon stood frozen, unable to utter a word. His eyes quickly scanned from the ring to Rachel's face, desperately searching for traces of the little girl from so long ago. There was something familiar, that gaze, those cheekbones, that straight-backed posture. But time had shaped that childhood face into a mature, experienced woman with a hardened look of someone who no longer waited for anyone to return. "That ring!" Brandon stammered, his throat dry. Where did you get it?" Rachel hesitated for a moment, instinctively closing her hand around the ring as though something in his gaze had exposed her. "It was left by my mother," she replied briefly. Her eyes never leaving Brandon's. But beneath that gaze lay a layer of unreadable defense. "Why is there a problem?" Brandon opened his mouth about to say something, then froze. How could he say that he was the boy from all those years ago, the one who had placed that ring on her hand? How could he admit that he had forgotten her? Had left behind his promise in the orphanage to step into a world of shareholder meetings, dinners with caviar and Dom Perignon, arranged relationships and paths paved with power. He had never returned. Never. Behind the polished exterior, beneath the perfectly tailored suit, was a Brandon Whitaker, who had always been controlled by his father like a pawn. Carter Whitaker had never let emotions interfere with his strategic decisions. The day Brandon secretly visited the orphanage to play with a little girl, his father cut off funding to the place, forcing it to close for unclear financial reasons. No warning, no clear explanation. Everything disappeared as if it had never existed, including the girl with the sapphire ring on her finger. Back then, Brandon had been just a child. He didn't understand why he couldn't go back, and over time, he forgot. Under his father's iron guidance, he buried that memory deep within his mind in exchange for recognition to become the man Carter wanted. Now that memory surfaced like a knife, not only cutting into his conscience, but also igniting a fear she might know more than just the ring. Brandon took a step back, took a deep breath, and tried to steady his voice. "Sorry, it's just it looks very familiar." Rachel pressed her lips together, saying nothing. She stepped back, shoved the money into her jeans pocket, then turned to walk toward her pickup truck. "If your car breaks down again, turn left into Aurora City," she said without turning her head. "My shop's behind the old wooden sign." Brandon stood still, his eyes never leaving Rachel's back. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but deep down he knew this was not just a random car repair. He had just touched a past he thought was gone, and it had left a mark with a ring. The silver Maserati drove off, leaving a thin trail of dust on the desolate road, the engine's roar fading in the oppressive Texas midday heat. Rachel stood still beside her old pickup truck, her hand still loosely holding the greasy rag she had just used to wipe her hands. A soft breeze passed, but it was not enough to cool the scorching heat that seemed to melt everything, including the memories that had been dormant within her for 2 decades. She raised her hand and gently touched the old silver ring, the only piece of jewelry she had worn her whole life. The small sapphire gleamed in the sunlight, but in Rachel's eyes, it was no longer just a piece of jewelry. It was a promise. A promise that had been broken. "He doesn't remember anything anymore," she whispered, her gaze following the fading dust cloud, "just like when he left." 10 minutes later, Rachel climbed into her truck, not in a hurry. She knew she had missed her deadline to deliver parts to a client, but she no longer cared. The unexpected return of Brandon Whitaker was not a passing breeze. It was a hidden storm, awakening the scar she had tried to bury under the toughened skin of a single mother. A mechanic who seemed only concerned with spark plugs, oil, and earning enough money to send her daughter to school. Her daughter Naomi, 13 years old, a gentle, smart angel who had never known her father and never asked about him. Rachel had never told her about the orphanage, about the boy who had once given her this ring, who had whispered, "I'll come back, I promise." Brandon never came back. She didn't wait, but she had never taken off the ring, not because she still loved him, but because she had never forgiven him. Back at the small repair shop on the edge of Aurora City, a dying town in the heart of Texas, where people left more than they arrived, Rachel turned off the engine and slowly pulled up the heavy metal door. Inside, the smell of motor oil and hot metal filled the air as if it were a part of her body. In the small room at the back of the shop, once a storage area, now a makeshift living room and bedroom, a faded photograph hung on the gray wall. A picture of Rachel at 12, standing in front of the New Hope orphanage beside a skinny white boy who was grinning widely. "Brandon," that boy once said, "what's broken can be fixed." She believed him. She waited. But one day, the orphanage managers announced that Brandon had left for good. She asked why. No one answered. Only a few weeks later, the orphanage's funding was cut and it was closed for lack of operational conditions. The children were scattered, sent elsewhere. Rachel was placed in a foster home, then ran away at 14 after being exploited as a maid without pay by that same family. There was only one person who didn't abandon her at that time. Uncle Luther, her mother's brother, the quiet man who had been a mechanic in the army, and now lived in seclusion in the small town, running a car shop to make ends meet. He took Rachel in, taught her how to live, how to hold a wrench, how to distinguish the sound of a choked engine, and how to tighten bolts not by force, but by feel. Rachel learned quickly, and she lived quietly until she was 24 when Naomi was born, the result of a mistake on a rainy night with a man who disappeared immediately after. Rachel decided she would never depend on anyone again. She rebuilt the shop, gave it a new name, Monroe Auto Works. The hand-painted sign, simple, without any flourish. But anyone who passed through the town knew car trouble. Knock on Monroe's door. And today the past she thought had been burned away with the sign saying New Hope Orphanage closed suddenly returned in the form of a man in a silk tie wearing Tom Ford cologne driving a Maserati, the one who had once held her hand under the oak tree saying "I'll come back." Brandon Whitaker, a name she still saw in the papers, in economic news, in photographs of handshakes with the president, or walking the red carpet with his wealthy fiancée at a consumer industry event. But above all, that name was the name of the person who had indirectly destroyed her life because it was his father, Carter Whitaker, who had ordered the funding to stop for the orphanage that year. Rachel had heard the rumors. Carter found out his son had relations with an orphan child from a lower class, and he saw that as a threat, an emotional weakness that needed to be eradicated. Rachel wasn't sure how much of that was true and how much was embellished. But she had never believed Brandon was blameless. He had promised and he hadn't kept his word. That evening, when Naomi went to bed, Rachel sat alone in the living room, the small desk lamp casting light on her old work. She opened the drawer, pulled out a wooden box. Inside were a stack of documents, old newspapers, and a file with a faded seal. Whitaker Development Project, confidential. She had collected them herself over 8 years, quietly like a gravedigger. The map of the land where her mother had once lived, now the site of the Aurora Rising Real Estate Development Project by the Whitaker Group. The attached document read, urgent retrieval due to waterway zoning. Property transferred to Whitaker Holdings through legal representative Carter Whitaker, confirming no legal heirs. A lie. Her mother, Amelia Monroe, had never died. Rachel had proof, a handwritten letter from 8 years ago with no return address, but the handwriting she recognized immediately, her mother's. In the letter, she wrote only one line. I didn't abandon you. They forced me to disappear. Rachel gently brushed her fingers over the fading ink. She had never told anyone. Not Luther, not Naomi. But now enough was enough. Brandon was back. Not as the old friend, but as the heir of the one who had taken everything from her. And if he thought she was still the little girl waiting under the oak tree for a promise, then he was about to face a very different woman, one who no longer expected to be remembered by her name, but who would make them remember the price of betrayal. The first breeze of the afternoon swept through the rusted tin roof of the Monroe Auto Works shop, carrying with it the clinking sound of tools hanging on the walls, clashing together like the drum beats signaling a storm was about to arrive. Inside the shop, the pungent smell of motor oil and burnt metal filled the air, blending with the rhythmic sound of metal tapping continuously from the lift at the far left corner. Rachel Monroe, her disheveled hair still not tied back, knelt beside an old pickup truck engine, unscrewing bolts as though she were tearing apart a memory that could not be denied. She wasn't doing it to repair. The engine should have been finished yesterday, but she had torn it apart for the third time. Not because of a technical fault, but because of the rage simmering in her chest, a pent-up anger that had been suppressed for years, now suddenly erupting, all because of one glance at a past embodied by Brandon Whitaker. A sharp screech echoed as the wrench slipped from the bolt, causing her glove to come off and cut a small line on Rachel's palm. Blood began to trickle out, but she didn't stop. Enough. A deep voice echoed from the workshop door. Luther Monroe, her uncle, who had raised her after her parents died, stepped in with a somber look in his eyes. He was a big man, his weathered face marked by the sun, his temples graying, and his hands calloused from years of holding a hammer. In his hand was a glass of cold lemonade, still dripping with condensation. Rachel didn't turn around. Her hands continued to remove the cylinder head as if every bolt was a chain that needed to be broken. You're destroying the carburetor, he said. His voice wasn't accusatory, just thick with a deep concern Rachel couldn't pretend not to hear. She paused, her shoulders shaking. Then, unable to hold back, she broke down. Silent tears flowing down her cheeks, dripping onto the hot metal. It's Brandon, she choked out. Brandon Whitaker? He doesn't recognize me. Just looked at the ring. Luther froze. A brief silence filled the workshop. He stepped forward, placed the glass of lemonade on the steel table, and then sat next to Rachel. Not rushing, not intruding. Only when she lifted her face, her eyes swollen, and her voice cracked, did he speak. He stood there looking at me like I was a stranger, like there was never a promise, like there was never a tree, an orphanage. An afternoon I waited. Luther looked at her, his eyes filled with deep sorrow, then whispered. The boy who promised to come back but never did. Rachel nodded, her lips pressed tight, her hands clenched so hard they turned white. And now, who is he? Luther asked. The CEO of Whitaker Global. Rachel replied. The son of Carter Whitaker, the one who will build that shopping center right on the land where my mother and I lived. Her final words rang like a hammer, striking a hot piece of iron. Luther stood up suddenly, pacing around the workshop, then turned back with a look of cold fury Rachel had never seen in him before. Carter Whitaker, he hissed, as if the name had a metallic taste. He's the one who signed the papers to seize the land when you weren't old enough to sign your own name. He's the one who forced your sister, Amelia, to leave town in the night, leaving no trace. You think this is all a coincidence? Rachel looked up, silent. Luther had never spoken of that fateful night when her mother, Amelia Monroe, disappeared just days after the government suddenly ordered the confiscation of land located on the region's largest waterway. He didn't just take the land, Luther continued, his voice deepening like the rumble of an engine. He took their honor, their blood, their family. Rachel bit her lip. And now, she whispered, his son stands before me with the face of a complete stranger. He even said my ring looked familiar. Luther narrowed his eyes and slowly sat down on the familiar wooden chair. His hand instinctively reached up to stroke his beard, a habit when he was deep in thought. He spoke. "I once thought maybe the boy was just a victim. But if now he doesn't recognize you, if he shows up just as the project begins, if he only looks at the ring and doesn't remember your name, then I'm not sure he's blameless anymore." Rachel nodded. Everything inside her had gone beyond personal hurt. This was no longer about a forgotten heart, but about justice being denied. "I have the files," Rachel exhaled, slowly standing up. "I have the old map, the fake death certificate for my mother. I even have the handwritten letter she sent 8 years ago. I just never dared to say it because there was no one to trust." Luther looked at Rachel for a long time, then gave a slow nod. "You're right. It's time to stop fixing cars and start fixing the wrongs." She stood still. For the first time in years, Rachel no longer saw herself just as a single mother, a mechanic. She saw herself as someone holding a crucial piece to expose an entire empire of lies. Brandon Whitaker might have forgotten, but he was about to remember because Rachel Monroe was ready to burn that Maserati if necessary to reclaim the name he had once taken lightly. As night fell over the town of Aurora, the Monroe Auto Works shop sank into silence with only the faint light shining through the crack in the window of the small bedroom at the back. Inside, Rachel sat on the old wooden floor, her back against the wall, her breath slow as though she were holding back a storm raging inside her chest. The conversation with Uncle Luther still echoed in her mind, each word like nails hammered deep into her heart. "If he doesn't recognize you, then I'm not sure he's innocent anymore." She reached under the bed, pulling out a small brown wooden box darkened by time. This old box wasn't just a place to hold memories. It was a place to hold the truth. A truth that had been buried deep for nearly 20 years out of fear, uncertainty, and because she hadn't been strong enough to fight alone. Rachel opened the lid. Inside, everything was neatly arranged in the way someone who was all too familiar with keeping secrets would do it. The first layer was filled with old newspaper clippings cut from business magazines, the financial section of the New York Observer, and a few printed photos from social media. The articles bore headlines such as "Brandon Whitaker, the ideal heir to the Whitaker Global Empire. From Harvard to the heights of corporate power, the journey of a young and promising CEO. Engaged to Elise Harrington, the billion-dollar union of two dynasties." The articles were marked with red pen underlining sections about land deals, upscale residential projects, particularly the Aurora Rising project. On an accompanying map, the land shaded in red was the very place Rachel's family had once lived, where she and her mother had planted flowers, lemon trees, and even the oak tree where Brandon had tied a blue ribbon, promising to return. It was their land, but the name on the papers now read, Carter Whitaker. Rachel sighed and carefully flipped the layer of newspapers, revealing the secret compartment beneath. What lay there made her heart ache with every touch. A thick legal file over 300 pages long, stamped with a faint but clear phrase. Mandatory buyout, Aurora Economic Zone Development Project. Legal representative Carter Whitaker, CEO of Whitaker Global. One page was a death certificate confirming that Amelia Monroe, Rachel's mother, had died in a car accident in 2007. But Rachel knew as instinctively as any child would that her mother had never died. That document was a lie. And she had proof, a handwritten letter in her mother's distinctive cursive sent from an undisclosed location in 2016. The letter contained only one line. "My daughter, I didn't abandon you. They forced me to disappear." Below was a shaky signature. Amelia. That letter had driven Rachel mad. She spent weeks comparing the handwriting, asking Luther, checking it against old postcards her mother had sent. It was her, no mistake. But who were they? And why did they want her mother to disappear? The answer lay in the transfer contract she found through an old friend working in the Jefferson County Land Registry office. A blurry copy, but still legible. This property is fully transferred to Whitaker Holdings under Clause 12B, Community Benefit and Regional Economic Development Agreement. There are no legal heirs recorded at the time of signing. Recipient Carter Whitaker. Rachel remembered the look in her former colleague's eyes as they handed her the file, a mixture of sympathy and fear. "I shouldn't have shown you this, but if it's you, I guess you have a right to know." In Rachel's mind, all the pieces started falling into place. Carter Whitaker was not just a cold CEO. He was the one who orchestrated a campaign to erase an entire family to legitimize a strategic piece of land located on one of the largest underground water sources in the South. Aurora wasn't just where she was born. It was the lifeblood of tens of thousands of people, and Carter saw its value long before anyone else. He didn't shy away from any method. He didn't hesitate. And now he was using his son, Brandon, as the new face, youthful and clean, for an empire built on forged documents and real pain. Rachel clenched a page of the documents, her palms sweating. She looked at the signature line. Carter Whitaker's bold, decisive handwriting felt like a dagger to her heart. She had once thought Brandon was innocent, that he was just a boy swallowed up by a world his father had set up for him. But today, when she saw his eyes that didn't recognize her, didn't remember the promise, she knew. Even if it was by accident, Brandon was still part of the system that had crushed her. A slight noise came from the hallway. Naomi, her daughter, cracked the door open. "Mom, you're not asleep." Rachel jumped quickly, closing the wooden box and hiding it under the bed. She turned, smiling gently, her face quickly regaining composure. "Not yet, sweetie. I'm just reading some documents." Naomi nodded, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Tomorrow I have a presentation on truth and justice. The teacher said each of us should tell a real story. Can I tell mine?" Rachel froze. After a long pause, she softly replied, "As long as you know what the truth is, you have every right to tell it." When Naomi returned to her bed, Rachel remained still by the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the street lights cast light onto the old oak tree growing beside the shop. The only tree left after the land seizure all those years ago, she whispered softly. "They buried my mother. They took our land, but they haven't buried me." She clenched her fist. If Brandon was the heir, then he would have to face the truth. A truth that couldn't be bought with a check, erased from the papers, or ignored like just another face in the crowd. The morning sunlight gently poured over the town of Aurora, a surprising contrast to the stifling heat of the previous day. Inside the Monroe Auto Works shop, there was no sound of metal tapping, nor the scent of burning engine parts, only silence, as if the entire space was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Rachel had woken early, making coffee like every other day, but the cup had long gone cold on the table, untouched. Her mind kept circling back to